Good. It's kind of chilly out there, isn't it? The sun goes away and then the temperature drops. Maybe that's a matter of me bringing the cold from New York. That means that it won't be cold when I go back home. Welcome back this afternoon. We've got a series of panel discussions, and I'm delighted to introduce the next panel that will be moderated by Benjamin Harvey, who is the bureau chief for Bloomberg News, based in Istanbul. If you don't actually know Benjamin's work, I mean, he's a really terrific journalist who has tremendous insights on the financial sector here in Turkey. He's been covering it since 2002, and so you can really tell that in his reporting. You need to follow him on Twitter because he actually has a really great presence on Twitter, and he's one of the funniest guys on Twitter, and he really gets Turkish humor. He speaks both. I mean, clearly he grew up in Alabama, but he speaks fluent Turkish, and it's such a joy to actually follow him. He's actually going to be talking about the investor environment here in Turkey, and the question before them is Turkey still sexy for investors? So I'm going to hand it over to Benjamin.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. I'm going to start out by just allowing our guests to introduce themselves. Bastian, you want to go first?
All right, so I work for Simile Venture. It's a Russian seed fund, and we invest actually in all the emerging markets. So I kind of know the problem emerging market can experience sometimes.
I'm Evren, I'm Turkish, and I'm a venture capitalist with Early Bird.
I'm Audrey, I'm French. I'm working for a venture capital firm based out of Paris, investing all over Europe. We have one investment in Turkey for now, which is called Ana Lütfen, an e-commerce company selling products for kids.
Okay, and when they proposed this topic to me, the word that I found interesting was still. Is Turkey still sexy for investors? And it suggested something in Turkey has changed, or something in the world has changed that is important. And so I tweeted this question, and I'll read some of the first answers that I got. The first one: if unabashed violation of human rights is your thing, sure. 2, as long as bribery is sexy. And 3, Turkey has never been sexy for investment. The Fed gave investors a hormonal imbalance. So obviously, if we didn't think Turkey was somehow attractive, none of us would be here. So take this with a grain of salt, but it does bring up 3 important issues. 1 is Turkey's record on free expression and freedom of thought, which now includes internet censorship, which is relevant for people in this room. 2 is a corruption scandal that, instead of leading to people being held accountable, seems to be leading to sort of a breakdown in Turkish institutions and rule of law. And the 3rd is about the Fed and whether Turkey's growth performance is sustainable in a world where capital is becoming more scarce, risk is being repriced, and investors are looking at risk in different ways. So let me just ask this question to all of our guests. Is Turkey still sexy?
So I am the first to answer this great question. I think I would not have been here if I didn't think that Turkey was sexy. It's true that Turkey is not our main target as a fund. We are a European fund, and it's part of our potential investments, but it's not our main target. However, we really think that it can be a country for high-growing companies, and we would like to take advantage of this. I really think that there are sustainable bases in Turkey, which makes it sexy. And even if we can argue about it later, even if there are some things that could make us think that it's not sexy anymore, I think that these bases are really sustainable, and that's why, as we are VC investors, we all know that it's a long-term financial asset, and we should not concentrate on the short-term issue, but more see in the long run. And I believe in Turkey for the long run.
Evren?
Yeah, I agree with Audrey, and following up on her point, what matters for long-term investors is long-term economic growth. And I'm now as confident as I ever was that the next 10, 15 years will be a period of very successful economic growth for Turkey. in particular that it will grow from a country with a GDP of $700-800 billion to a country with a GDP of something on the order of $1.5 trillion. And in the process, there will be always volatility. But if you're a long-term investor, you're much more focused on the long-term upside rather than the kind of kinks on the way.
All right, yeah, so I believe that when you decide as an investor to go into the emerging markets, you know there are going to be ups and downs, and you can't expect having steady growth like you can experience in developed markets. But while during the crisis time, it's also where you find amazing entrepreneurs that manage both to sustain and even to grow the business. And when recovery would come, because it's a long-run investment, then they would have such a big knowledge about the market, about the insights, about the ability to take good decisions, that would be really hard for a new entrant to compete with them. So I guess during crisis you learn a lot. So it's a lot about the risk profile of each investor, whether you want to take the bet now while it's risky, but then comes the reward. And Audrey has a risk profile, everyone has one, and they're all different. So it also really matters, and it's also a big matter of depending on the sectors. I would talk about consumer internet and digital media because that's where my expertise is. But everyone's expertise would be more maybe about gaming, and it's not the same game then. Yeah.
So it's fortune favors the bold kind of thing. Another question I want to ask is that all of you are looking at different markets, right? And what's important in the investment game is relative value. If Turkey looks less attractive, it doesn't matter as much as if the whole world looks less attractive, right? But where does Turkey fit in your investment strategy? Where does it compare with other countries?
Let me first try to address that. My real expertise is actually, some of you know me, economics and finance. I ended up in the technology sector in the last 3 years. If you look at Turkey, the entire stock market is right now worth $220 billion. Entire stock market is worth less than a top 50 Fortune 50 company. And if you look at the portion of that is actually traded rather than held by families, it's around $70 billion. So what this means, two things. One reason is that the current valuations in the stock market are extremely cheap. This is a result of the recent events, right? When you have such a thinly traded equity market, even $5-10 billion of capital outflows can affect the prices significantly, and they also affect the exchange rate significantly, because when foreign investors sell, they buy dollars, they sell Turkish lira. So I do think that actually right now we're at a very interesting point when there's a great opportunity, not just kind of in our industry, but also in general for a macro long-term investor looking into Turkey. I think this is really the best time to invest maybe in the entire Turkish history. And I'm happy to always elaborate, as Ben knows from our long dinner conversation yesterday, but that's my view on the subject.
But if you're comparing it, say, maybe it's the most attractive time for Turkey, but if you're comparing it to other countries, let's say you guys are also probably looking in Eastern Europe, you're looking in maybe it's South Africa, you mentioned Brazil. What are Turkey's competitive advantages and weaknesses as well?
So while all the emerging markets are experiencing turmoil right now, except for Southeast Asia, because they are at different stage of development, there are several countries. But if you look Brazil, it's the same. Like they have big issues right now. Currency is not good. There were American pouring funds a few years ago. Now they're being really cautious about that. The good thing about Turkey is that you have sustainable assets. You have a good infrastructure, which Brazil hasn't. There's also a really good logistics system for delivery, shipping, exporting, and everything. Same, Brazil has big issues with that. And there's also the banking system, which is like still good for an emerging market. It's much better than the one you can have in Brazil, for instance. So for this reason, this crisis could be solved much easier. It's a less deeply rooted problem as Brazil could have. So it's still like our sweet spot is still Southeast Asia, Turkey, and when you look at Brazil and India, I think it's still tougher there.
Are you finding that when you're trying to convince people to make an investment in Turkey that the perception has changed due to what's going on here? that you have to, that it's a harder sell?
Well, it has changed. Well, the first time I came to Turkey was a year ago, so I'm still in a year. I still consider I'm still new to the market, so things have changed. But it's more on the macroeconomical level that affects, and that really affects the fact that funds would be more cautious about the investment because of the political environment. But here I'm more talking about foreign fund willing to invest in Turkey. So those funds would be more cautious right now, for sure.
And Audrey, competitive?
I totally agree with Bastien. I think that there are some sustainable assets, and every market, there are some issues in every market. Our main market is France, and everyone is speaking about the issue of the regulation, which is changing every time. So I think we have to adapt ourselves to each market we invest in, but there is no perfect market. So it's hard to compare them. All of them have some great things, other issues. And as Bastien mentioned, there are great fundamentals here, and I would add one to the one you already mentioned, which is the quality of the entrepreneurs, which bothers us the most as VC managers. Indeed, I think that here in Istanbul, here in Turkey, and also when I go to Istanbul, I find entrepreneurs which are very well educated, which understand very well all the business issues. They come from great universities. They speak the same language that I speak, and even my first trip to Turkey, it was easy to communicate with them because we all spoke the same language, I would say, the same business language. So. It's another great asset, and it's not in all countries. It's not like this. I would also add that we also went to Russia 4 or 5 years ago, and when going to Russia, when we did our first investment in Russia, our LPs were like, "Well, you're crazy. Why are you going to Russia? There are so many problems, corruption, and so on." And actually, we did very well. And as Bastien said, I think that during crises, when you take the risk, it pays. So of course there are issues, but we have to just adapt ourselves to them and take advantage of them.
And when we heard the term sustainable assets mentioned a couple of times, what exactly do you mean by that? And probably of interest to people in this room. When you're looking at business in Turkey, what kind of businesses, what sectors are you interested in? Evren, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I'm wearing two hats as an ex-finance economist. I think the entirety of Turkey is very sustainable. If you look at the world, there are maybe 20, 25 high-growth countries, middle-income countries that are catching up. Of these, most of them are in one way or another broken, either rule of law or infrastructure or just many of the key elements you need for growth to become a rich country, to produce more and increase your GDP. They're just not in place. And Bastien mentioned some of those key success factors like infrastructure and rule of law and et cetera, et cetera. So I won't go into that, and human capital and entrepreneurship and Turkey is very unique across the growth markets in the world that it actually has all of these things. And maybe Brazil is another example, and maybe there's one or two other countries that have kind of everything in place. India, maybe, if you choose to ignore the horrible bureaucracy. So I think that is very unique and very sustainable about Turkey and its economy, and why I'm so bullish about the Turkish economy going forward. In terms of sectors, we obviously focus on as a venture capital firm, we focus on early stage companies that are today relatively small, but that we believe can become large companies in the future. Our typical test is, can we see this company doing a $200 million exit in the next 5-10 years? So that's typically the key test for us.
I also think that it's a great country because there are high cultural barrier to entries. I think it's not so easy for a US company to come to Turkey and just launch a subsidiary here and without adapting to the cultural business here. So for us as a global venture capitalist, it's also interesting to see the potential exits, and I think that's investing in Turkish entrepreneurs who know very well their country, but who also are very open to all the models, all the global models. Then there are a lot of opportunities for selling their companies maybe at one point to US or European guys who couldn't do it themselves.
Bastian?
Yeah, I think one concern that I would raise about Turkey right now is on the entrepreneur side. Some entrepreneurs would say, okay, there's a big shortage of funding available right now for us. So they would tend to be more cautious and say, no, I'm not actually going to launch my startup right now. And I think that's a mistake, because as investor, we're really ready to take the risk. And I don't see any investor, any entrepreneur saying, okay, I have this idea, I'm the one that's going to make it happen, and I'm going to make the investor dream. I don't see the investor come back and say, no, actually the Turkish lira is devaluating too much, we're not going to invest. So it can still happen. And the big risk is on the entrepreneur side that they would be less likely to start businesses because they believe they're not going to be able to achieve anything because of this shortage of funding.
Well, we're at that point. I think that's actually a very good idea. Turkey does not lack in entrepreneurship. I often joke that if you go to some place in Istanbul and turn 5 random people from the street, you'll probably get 25 business plans. The entrepreneurship is not something that we lack. I think what we lack as Turks, and we also have to be self-critical, because that is also important for success, is we lack commitment. We lack patience. And we lack the patience to see things through sometimes. And I think a big indication for Turkey is that, again, if you look at the stock market, just to pick on some data, you will not find a single company today with a market cap higher than $15 billion. Not a single one. So in the entire country, even though it has so many large companies, banks, etc., has not been able to produce a global champion. And I think that is symptomatic of something. It doesn't prevent Turkey from growing into a $1 or $2 trillion economy, but I think that it does prevent Turkey growing into a $5-10 trillion economy in 30, 40 years. And our entrepreneurs need to learn to be more patient and to commit into what they're really doing. And I don't mean just entrepreneurs here and the startup, etc., but it's a general trait that we have, that we achieve some success and then get spoiled too quickly. And I think if I could change one thing about Turkey, culturally, in terms of the business culture, that would be the one thing I would focus on.
Yeah, I would also say that Turkish entrepreneurs are really local, while they have this big access to the MENA region. Yeah. I think they should think more globally, like they do in Southeast Asia, where when you launch a venture, you already have a plan to go to Thailand, Indonesia first, then you go to other markets. So they have really milestones that they would like to achieve. And here, they talk about the domestic market, and I think it's too bad, because there's so much opportunity in the region, and the actually only entrepreneurs that could do that are the Turkish entrepreneurs.
Yeah, it seems to me that that's a bit of a risk. Turks have to decide whether we're going to be companies that tap this market, and it's an attractive market, okay, 80 million people, or whether we're going to be a center of innovation that goes and acts as a gateway to other countries. What are you looking for when are you looking at Turkey as a market? You're obviously looking for Turks who are looking to break into new markets.
No, we're looking Turkey as a market because it has a big domestic market, and that's what we look for. But I was thinking have a more global strategy, thinking of even going into the MENA, but also going into Europe. I mean, it can definitely be done. So I would like to see more business plans and more ideas and more founders focusing on we're going to grow these companies really big, not just building a local champion, but actually a European or world champion.
I think there's about this, whether Turkey's a market or a center of innovation. I think we've seen some companies coming here, and their idea was to invest in Turkish companies, to bring Turkish entrepreneurs to the world, bring them to Europe, and bring them to the rest of the region. But some of them we've seen that they changed their business plan after a few years and decided, okay, we still believe in Turkey as a market, but what we want to do is take companies from Europe and bring them to Istanbul and tap that market. Is that a debate you guys have internally as well?
I think that we have different models. We can invest in different kinds of companies. When we invested in Anne Lutfen a year and a half ago, the idea was not at all to invest in the Turkish market specifically. It's just that we saw many companies with the same model. One was in Russia, one was in France, one was in the UK, and we just liked this model, and we were looking for great entrepreneurs executing very well this model that we liked. And we fell in love with Roy, who is doing a very good job. And we just thought that it was the best company in Europe, in our target, doing this, executing this model. So we investing in her, in this team, because we thought that they could execute very well the model. But then, of course, there are other models where we look for being global from the beginning. But I mean, we can invest in different companies with different strategy. But I would not say that a Turkish company has to be global for one of my investment. I also think that it's important to grow step by step. First, you have to prove your model in your own market, and then see if you execute well enough to reach other markets.
Yeah, I totally agree, but it was more in the spirit, saying we should start in Turkey, but then we should have a bigger vision actually. But of course, you start with Turkey. There's enough to do already here. So
yeah, it's a big
it's
market.
more on the longer run, and it's more about the spirit itself of being an entrepreneur and willing to do something big, not just medium.
I agree, but the entrepreneurs that I met, they all did their studies in the UK or in the US, so they already know the other market. It's not as if they were self-centric on the Turkish market.
Yeah.
They all know the other, either the European or the US markets, so they know that, we know as investors that at one point, if they are doing already well in Turkey, we could bring them to other countries.
I think, well, we're actually running a little bit over time, but if anybody has any questions, be happy to take them from anyone. Nothing? Any final words?
We are not sexy yet.
Yeah. I mean, anything that you guys are curious about from an investor perspective? No? Go ahead.
Sorry, I know Audrey.
Yeah?
She's into the marketplace investments, but I would like to hear from all of you, including Audrey, what do you think of marketplace and how? I know it's a tough thing to start. Sorry, I was asking about marketplace. I know it's a tough investment to start, or a tough venture to start, but I know everyone likes it when it happens.
Yeah.
But what do you think about an early stage startup that's trying to do that?
I'm a journalist, so I have no opinion of my own at all.
Everyone, I'll leave it to you.
Depends. Marketplaces are usually harder to start. It takes 3-4 years until you see real revenue, because you have to manage both sides of the marketplace, create real liquidity and differentiation before you start seeing some money. But after you do that, it's typically a more defendable business model. But it depends on what exactly you're trying to do. Is the goods marketplace Turkish-based, Middle East? So
It's also usually, marketplaces are also usually actually a local bet, because you have to find the equilibrium between offer and demand, but in every local, sometimes even every city or even every area. And so to me, it's very important to know from the beginning what are the priorities. Do you want to be only in big cities and then find this equilibrium in big cities but in various countries, or do you want to stay in only one country but trying to build it in every city? I would think like this.
Question.
Go ahead.
With the recently passed law on censorship, how are investors looking at the general Turkish technology internet market?
Bastian, go ahead.
Okay. Well, as we mentioned several, like it's each country, has its problem. So right now, there's this problem in Turkey, but I mean, how long is it gonna last? It's tough. It's tough to say. But my point is that I think Turkey has the power of recovering quickly. So that's really what we're looking forward to see now. So I hope for everyone it's gonna happen sometimes in 2015.
If I well remember, I think that it's in Chinese that the word crisis has integrates the word opportunity. I think that indeed from issues you can create a lot of opportunities that you couldn't have created before. And again, it's a short-term issue, and we are betting on long-term.
And on that note,
Great. Well, please, a round of applause for our panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.